Have you ever found yourself sitting amidst a seemingly lively animated conversation, perhaps surrounded by laughter and enthusiastic chatter, yet feeling profoundly, almost jarringly out of place? As if you were an anthropologist observing a strange, incomprehensible ritual from a detached, perhaps slightly bewildered distance. Have you ever looked around a room filled with people engaged in intricate social maneuvering? The subtle power plays, the performative agreeableness, the desperate scramble for status or acceptance, and wondered, with genuine, unadulterated bewilderment, why do individuals try so incredibly exhaustingly hard to simply fit in, to conform, to meticulously blend themselves seamlessly into the expected, often predictable patterns of behavior, belief, and expression? Have you ever harbored the quiet, perhaps even slightly guilty, deeply unsettling feeling that most conventional social interactions, the ones society deems essential for happiness and success, feel like a rather pointless, energy-draining game? A complex, often tedious performance whose intricate rules you understand perfectly well, perhaps even too well, but fundamentally deep in your core, don't want to play. If any of these sentiments resonate deeply disturbingly within you, if they echo a hidden, perhaps unacknowledged truth about your own experience of the world, then this exploration is unequivocally urgently for you. And if perhaps you haven't consciously experienced these feelings, if this sounds alien or exaggerated, maybe it's time to rigorously, honestly question whether you've been inadvertently comfortably living a lie, comfortably numb, safely ensconced within the very system, the very social farce we're about to meticulously, perhaps uncomfortably dissect. Because today we are going to delve headfirst into an uncomfortable, often inconvenient truth. A perspective frequently dismissed, ignored, or even pathologized in our hypersocialized, extrovert-biased world. A truth articulated with characteristic brutal clarity, unflinching realism, and profound psychological insight by Arthur Schopenhauer. The philosopher often lazily dubbed the philosopher of pessimism, though perhaps more accurately, more usefully described as the unflinching philosopher of realism, a diagnostician of the human condition. Schopenhauer perceived with a piercing, almost painful insight that cut through societal illusions that most people live their lives fundamentally trapped within a pervasive, often invisible social farce. They meticulously dress, carefully behave, cautiously speak, and curate their opinions, not necessarily as their authentic inner selves dictate, not from a place of genuine conviction or spontaneous expression, but rather primarily performatively as they think they should, based on prevailing societal expectations, ingrained cultural norms, and the perceived, often desperately sought path to acceptance, belonging, and validation. Not because it reflects their true unique inner nature, but because they have been systematically, often, subtly, yet relentlessly programmed, conditioned from birth, from their earliest moments of social awareness, to relentlessly, almost compulsively seek external acceptance as the primary, perhaps the only source of validation, security, meaning, and self-worth. But right here arrives the critical, often unasked, potentially life-altering question that almost no one dares to ask aloud, the question that threatens to unravel the entire fragile edifice. Acceptance from whom exactly? From the fickle crowd, from individuals who themselves may be lost, confused, or inauthentic, from a system designed more for conformity than for truth, and perhaps even more importantly, more consequentially, acceptance at what ultimate irreversible cost. Think, honestly, critically, courageously about your own lived experiences. How many countless times have you patiently, perhaps excruciatingly endured utterly pointless, mind-numbingly trivial conversations filled with predictable platitudes, regurgitated opinions, and superficial gossip solely to avoid appearing rude, aloof, socially awkward, or different? How many times have you forced a polite, socially acceptable laugh at a joke that genuinely didn't amuse you in the slightest, perhaps even found it offensive or stupid? How many times have you walked away from a social interaction, a party, a meeting, feeling subtly yet undeniably drained, vaguely depleted, psychically diminished, sensing on some intuitive level that every single engagement felt like a subtle, unspoken transaction, a delicate, often exhausting negotiation where you were implicitly, consistently expected to give away a precious part of yourself, your finite time, your vital energy, your authentic opinion, your honest disagreement, your very presence, simply in exchange for the fleeting, ephemeral, ultimately unsatisfying feeling of belonging, of being temporarily included, accepted, validated within the fold, within the herd. And now the question that truly cuts to the core, the one that genuinely profoundly matters, the one that demands your unflinching self-examination. At what ultimate, perhaps devastating cost does this relentless, often unconscious pursuit of social acceptance, of fitting in, of avoiding disapproval truly come? At the cost of your precious, irreplaceable time, your finite vital energy, your fundamental integrity, your authentic voice, your very soul. Schopenhauer, never one to mince words or offer comforting illusions, made his position unequivocally, starkly clear. Intelligence, particularly deep, philosophical, critical intelligence, and conventional social life are often, perhaps inevitably, fundamentally in conflict. The more intellectually developed, curious, and discerning you become, the more acutely, sometimes painfully aware you are of the nuances, the complexities, the contradictions, the often hidden absurdities of existence and human behavior, the less intrinsic sense, the less genuine appeal you often find in participating wholeheartedly, enthusiastically, unquestioningly in the pervasive, often superficial, frequently illogical social farce. Not necessarily, or even usually, because you harbour feelings of innate arrogance, intellectual superiority, or disdain for others, though that certainly can be a potential pitfall, an ego trap for the unwary, intelligent mind. But primarily, fundamentally, because your heightened awareness, your clarity of perception, your ability to see beneath the surface, allows you, perhaps forces you to see what others often don't, or perhaps more accurately actively choose not to see, preferring the comfort of illusion over the discomfort of truth. You begin with this sharpened perception to clearly perceive the ubiquitous, often elaborate masks people wear, the carefully constructed personas, to use Jung's term, designed not for authentic expression, but for strategic, social navigation, for impression management. You discern with growing clarity the subtle, pervasive lies disguised as common courtesy, the polite, often meaningless falsehoods uttered simply to maintain superficial harmony, to avoid uncomfortable truths, to grease the wheels of social interaction. You sense, perhaps with a growing sense of unease or even alienation, the underlying, often desperate fragility of a social world, where almost everyone seems desperately, relentlessly seeking validation, meaning, and self-worth, not from within their own being, not from their own values or accomplishments, but solely precariously within the fleeting, often fickle, frequently distorting eyes of others. And perhaps the most terrifying, most isolating realization of all you see, that most people actively, perhaps defensively, prefer to ignore this underlying, often uncomfortable reality, clinging instead with fierce tenacity to the comforting, familiar illusions of effortless social connection, universal goodwill, and the paramount importance of external approval. Society, Schopenhauer might argue with his characteristic pessimism or realism, depending on your perspective, is largely, perhaps even primarily designed to keep you perpetually entertained, distracted, occupied, superficially engaged, not fundamentally challengingly, to encourage you to think deeply, critically, independently, authentically. Because the moment you genuinely begin to think too much, too deeply, too questioningly, you inevitably, unavoidably start to notice the inherent incoherence, the glaring contradictions, the often absurd, almost comical nature of many social conventions, traditions, and expectations. You begin to realize, perhaps, with a growing, painful sense of disillusionment, that most relationships, even those labeled close, are built on foundations far more superficial, far more transactional, far more conditional than genuine, deep soul-to-soul connection. That most conversations, particularly casual social chatter, are little more than noise distractions, skillfully designed to fill uncomfortable silences, to avoid genuine vulnerability, to maintain the safe, predictable status quo. And that the immense, often exhausting effort required to constantly fit in, to meticulously conform, to perform flawlessly according to unwritten social scripts and expectations is often in reality a profound, tragic form of self-sabotage, a slow, insidious erosion of your own authentic being, your unique perspective, your irreplaceable soul. And herein lies the profound, often painful dilemma, frequently almost inevitably faced by the intellectually inclined, the critically thinking, the authenticity-seeking individual, navigating a world that often seems hostile to those very qualities. If you possess the intelligence, the awareness, the clarity to notice the superficiality, the constraints, the often soul-crushing nature of the social farce, then you are likely also sensitive enough, perceptive enough to acutely, painfully feel the loneliness, the alienation, the sense of otherness that this very awareness, this clarity, this refusal to fully participate in the collective illusion often brings in its wake. Because let's face the stark, often uncomfortable reality. The more independently, authentically you think, the more you prioritize genuine truth over convenient falsehood. The more you value deep connection over superficial interaction, the more you honor your own inner compass over external validation, the less you naturally, comfortably, seamlessly fit in with the conventional, often mindless patterns of mainstream social interaction. And people, the majority, the conformists, the ones invested in maintaining the status quo, sense this. They instinctively, perhaps unconsciously, feel your subtle detachment, your lack of unbridled enthusiasm for their games, your quiet refusal to fully participate in the collective hysteria of fleeting trends, popular opinions, or manufactured outrage. They perceive, perhaps accurately, perhaps defensively, that you don't engage in common social rituals, the gossip, the small talk, the performative outrage, the obligatory celebrations, with the same blind, unquestioning, perhaps desperate devotion as they do. And this difference, your quiet yet potent refusal to fully conform, your subtle yet undeniable embodiment of an alternative way of being, often bothers them, unsettles them, perhaps even threatens them on some deep unconscious level. Precisely because your mere existence, your quiet dissent, your embodiment of independent thought poses an implicit, uncomfortable threat to the comfortable, fragile bubble of unquestioned beliefs, shared illusions, and collective self-deceptions they inhabit. Your clarity illuminates their confusion. Your freedom highlights their chains. Schopenhauer never wanted to shy away from harsh truths, put it bluntly, perhaps even harshly, potentially sounding elitist to modern ears, yet containing a kernel of profound psychological insight. Solitude is the fate of all great minds. And acknowledging this potential fate, this inherent tension between deep thought and conventional sociability often hurts. It hurts profoundly. Because society, from our earliest, most impressionable years, relentlessly, systematically conditions us, programs us to believe that ultimate happiness, fulfillment, and validation lie primarily, perhaps exclusively, in connecting with others, in belonging seamlessly to the group, in being accepted, liked, popular. That you need a wide circle of friends, often measured quantitatively, shallowly, constant social engagements, a strong, unwavering sense of group belonging to be considered successful. Normal psychologically, healthy, fulfilled solitude, conversely, is often pathologized, framed as failure, loneliness, inadequacy, something to be feared and avoided at all costs. But what happens inevitably when you begin to realize, perhaps through painful personal experience, perhaps through dawning intellectual awareness, that most of those conventional social connections, those widely celebrated group affiliations, often feel profoundly empty, disappointingly superficial, utterly devoid of genuine intellectual stimulation, deep emotional resonance, or authentic soul connection? What happens when you recognize with growing clarity that the implicit, often unspoken price of constant socializing, of maintaining membership in the herd, is often a subtle yet pervasive, insidious pressure towards mediocrity, towards diluting your own unique thoughts, perspectives, and insights, to fit the lowest common denominator, towards silencing your authentic voice for the sake of maintaining superficial harmony? What typically happens almost organically is that you instinctively, perhaps desperately, begin to look for something more, something deeper, something more authentic, something that genuinely nourishes your mind, your heart, your soul. You naturally, perhaps gradually, start to withdraw selectively from interactions, relationships, social circles that feel consistently draining, pointless, inauthentic, or intellectually stultifying. You begin, perhaps for the first time, to truly value your own time, your own thoughts, your own inner world, your precious solitude, far more infinitely, more than the fleeting, often fickle, frequently conditional approval or validation of other people of the anonymous crowd. And here, precisely here, is where something truly curious, almost paradoxical, deeply transformative begins to occur. Initially, this chosen loneliness, This deliberate withdrawal from the noise and demands of the conventional social world might feel like a form of punishment, a confirmation of your perceived otherness, your supposed inability to fit in your fundamental social inadequacy. It might echo the painful rejections or misunderstandings of the past, but then gradually, patiently, if you persist, if you consciously embrace the space, the silence, the solitude it creates, it begins almost alchemically to transform into a profound, precious privilege, because it is precisely uniquely within that chosen solitude, that intentional, courageous withdrawal from the external noise, the incessant demands, the superficial distractions, that you finally truly discover something invaluable, something sacred, something society, in its relentless pursuit of conformity and productivity, often actively, perhaps deliberately tries to hide from you, tries to prevent you from accessing at all costs genuine peace of mind, the quiet sanctuary of your own sovereign consciousness. Schopenhauer understood this complex paradoxical dynamic perhaps better than anyone before or since. For him, heightened intelligence, profound insight, a deep philosophical temperament wasn't just an unmitigated blessing, a source of pure enlightenment and joy. It was also inevitably, unavoidably a kind of curse, a burden specifically within the context, the often suffocating confines of conventional society. The more deeply clearly you understand the often harsh, uncomfortable, complex realities of the world and the frequently irrational, self-serving, contradictory nature of human beings, the less its superficial charms, its fleeting distractions, its manufactured excitements tend to genuinely entice or satisfy you. The more clearly, analytically you see the often petty motivations, the predictable, repetitive patterns, the underlying insecurities driving much of human behavior, the less intrinsic desire, the less genuine inclination you feel to be an active, enthusiastic, unquestioning participant in its often tiresome, frequently draining, sometimes utterly absurd game. And here is where many individuals encountering these potentially challenging Schopenhauerian ideas for the first time might go astray, might misinterpret the core message. They might mistakenly defensively interpret this perspective as an invitation towards bitter misanthropy, assuming it's fundamentally about cultivating a generalized hatred, contempt or disdain for people, for humanity itself. They might assume it's advocating for a complete, absolute rejection of all social contact, a retreat into isolated, resentful hermitage. But it is absolutely, fundamentally not. That interpretation misses the profound subtlety, the crucial nuance, the liberating core of the insight. The core of Schopenhauer's insight, as I interpret it, as it relates to navigating the social world with intelligence and integrity, is about understanding, embracing, and acting upon the crucial life-altering difference between authentic human interaction, based on genuine resonance, mutual respect, intellectual stimulation, shared values, soul connection, and mere social obligation, performative interaction, superficial conformity undertaken primarily out of fear habit, or the desperate need for external validation. It's about consciously, courageously, giving yourself permission to choose deliberately, selectively, wisely, when and with whom you genuinely wish to socialize, based on authentic connection, mutual enrichment, and profound respect for your own time and energy, rather than simply passively, miserably drifting along, carried by the relentless currents of societal expectations, cultural norms, or the paralyzing fear of being alone, of being perceived as different. It's about fundamentally, radically accepting that true deep intelligence, the kind that questions, probes, analyzes, seeks authenticity, values depth, simply does not need constant external validation, incessant social interaction, or the superficial approval of the undifferentiated crowd to know, to feel, to inhabit its own intrinsic worth, its own inherent sufficiency. But here comes the truly fascinating part, the almost counterintuitive yet consistently observable outcome, the subtle alchemy of self-possession. When you genuinely, authentically stop seeking external acceptance, when you release the desperate, often subconscious need to fit in, to be liked, to be approved of by everyone, something profound, almost magical, often changes within you energetically, and consequently, almost inevitably, in how others perceive and respond to you. People notice. They subtly, perhaps unconsciously register that you are not desperate, not needy, not frantically vying for entry into their circles, not constantly angling for their approval. They sense that your fundamental sense of self-worth doesn't depend precariously entirely on their fluctuating, often arbitrary approval or disapproval. They perceive, perhaps with a mixture of confusion and grudging respect, that your inner world, your sense of well-being, doesn't crumble, doesn't shatter if you happen not to be invited to the next party, the next meeting, the next obligatory social gathering. And this quiet, unwavering self-sufficiency, this subtle yet palpable lack of overt neediness, this refusal to play the desperate game of seeking external validation often confuses them, unsettles them, perhaps even intimidates them slightly. Why? Because most people tragically operate consciously or unconsciously, almost entirely trapped within the pervasive, exhausting need to be seen, heard, approved of, validated, liked. Your deliberate, conscious non-participation in that exhausting, often soul-crushing game makes you an enigma, an anomaly, a quiet challenge to their entire way of being. An enigma that sometimes inevitably intimidates or provokes resentment in those most insecure. An enigma that often paradoxically powerfully intrigues those who possess a degree of self-awareness themselves. Because the ultimate irony, the beautiful liberating paradox of it all, is that the less you demonstrably anxiously care about achieving superficial social validation, about fitting in, about gaining approval, the more authentic, unspoken power you paradoxically seem to possess over the social dynamic, and often consequently the more genuine, unforced respect you inadvertently, almost effortlessly command. True, authentic, unshakable freedom invariably begins the precise moment you no longer fundamentally, existentially worry about what others think of you, about whether you meet their expectations, about whether you fit into their narrow boxes. So, the next time someone, perhaps well-meaning, perhaps subtly critical, implicitly or explicitly tells you that you should socialize more, that you should try harder to be more conventionally sociable, outgoing, agreeable, that you should simply strive, perhaps unauthentically, to be more like everyone else. Remember this profound, potentially liberating Schopenhauerian perspective. It is not necessarily you who is fundamentally wrong, deficient, inadequate, or broken. You are perhaps simply someone who has begun courageously, perhaps painfully, to see the truth. The often uncomfortable, inconvenient truth of the social game, the societal farce with uncomfortable, perhaps even devastating clarity. And that truth, for most people deeply, comfortably invested in playing the game according to the established familiar rules, is simply too uncomfortable, too challenging, too threatening, to their established way of being, to their cherished illusions, to readily, easily, willingly accept or acknowledge your clarity as a mirror they may not be ready or willing to look into.